Asha stood in the shade of a cloth stall and watched the market move like a river. The air smelled of oil, smoke, and warm bread. Lanterns swung above the crowd, making small circles of light. People walked with quick, careful steps. Their faces were tired. They moved as if each step cost something. On a raised platform, children stood in rows. Their shoes were worn. Their clothes were patched. A man with a loud voice read names and prices. He spoke like a clerk, sorting things by number. People in the crowd whispered and nodded. Some counted coins. Some turned away. Asha remembered a room with a blackboard and chalk. She remembered small hands raised to ask questions. Once she had taught songs and letters. Now she had a small bag of nails and one good memory. She felt the memory like a piece of soft cloth inside her chest. A little boy hugged a rag doll. The doll's thread showed where someone had mended it many times. A girl kept her chin high but her fingers were white with fear. Asha felt a cold stone in her stomach. She had not thought she would watch children sold like tools. When the gavel fell, a child walked away with a man in a dark coat. The child stepped slow and small. The crowd clapped. Someone said, "This keeps order." Someone else counted coins. The market moved on, like nothing had happened. After the platform emptied, one boy stayed behind. He looked at the ground, then at the crowd, then at Asha. He was small and muddy and had eyes that watched like they held a secret. He slipped a folded scrap of paper into his rag doll and smoothed the cloth with careful hands. Then he met Asha's eyes and did not look away. When the crowd left, Asha took the scrap from the doll. The paper was thin and creased. On one side there was a small drawing. On the back, in crooked child letters, it said, "Teach me." N. That night Asha walked to a small shed behind the bakery. The room smelled of flour and old wood. The window had no glass. A broken bench sat against the wall. On the floor lay old sacks and a cracked slate. The shed was nothing, but it had a roof and a quiet hush. She cleaned the floor with an old broom. She swept away dust and bits of paper. She put the scrap on a bench as if it were a seed. Asha lit a small lamp. The flame made a small circle of light in the dark room. She sat and held the scrap and let the quiet settle. Slowly, small feet came. Children arrived one by one. They came with stolen pencils and broken rulers. They sat on the benches and looked at the lamp. Their faces were open and sharp. Asha did not promise a miracle. She told them she would teach them letters and how to count. She told them she would teach them small skills that might keep them safe. The children listened like birds. She began simply. She wrote letters on the slate and showed how a line and a curve could make a sound. She taught numbers by counting nails and pieces of wood. She taught them to read a map by showing how a line could mean a road and a dot could mean a house. She turned simple things into tools. One boy, who called himself N, learned fast. He drew a small plan on the back of the scrap, a tiny machine with a spring and a paper lens. He said it could fly for a short time and bring back a picture. The children laughed at first. Then they leaned closer. They built the small machine from bits found in the market. Jamil found a cracked lens. Myra found a thin spring. Tarek tied small pieces with careful hands. The machine was rough and odd and beautiful to them. On a night with no moon, they set it up and let it go. The little machine lifted like a frightened bird. It bumped and wavered over rooftops. It dipped near a patrol and rose again. When it returned, it carried a scrap of cloth. The cloth smelled of salt and money. It had a small embroidered mark of a buyer. The children held the cloth and stared. Asha felt a soft, steady fire inside her. This small thing had done what words could not. It had shown proof. The market buyers did not only take children, they marked them and moved them and kept lists. The cloth had a mark that meant far more than its stitches. Word moved fast in the lanes. A soldier came to the shed the next day. He wore a paper with the governor's seal. He read one line, then looked up with a small smile that did not reach his eyes. "Suspicion of illegal gatherings," he said. His voice was flat and its meaning was sharp as a blade. The children pressed close behind Asha. Their small hands held pencils like promises. Asha closed the door slowly. She set the lamp steadier on the table. Outside, the city moved and the guards' boots rubbed echo on the stones. Inside, the scrap waited on the bench like a small flame. Asha looked at the children. She felt a choice clear as a path. She could hide, and the market would take more. Or she could teach, and perhaps the children could learn things that could not be bought or sold. She put her hand on the rag doll and spoke in a voice low and steady. "Then let them come and learn," she said. Boots came nearer. The lamp burned steady. The small machine's design sat folded in a boy's pocket. The market had sold their children, but the shed had begun to grow something else. The classroom was a small idea with sharp edges. It would not be silent for long. Rain came slow and cold the morning the buyers stopped the cart. The city smelled of wet stone and smoke. People watched from doorways. The buyers moved with smooth hands and faces that did not show trouble. They opened the cart and took a child. The crowd stepped back as if a tide had pulled away. Asha stood in the shed and felt a hard shape rise in her chest. She did not shout. She did not run. She did what she always did first: she listened. The children around her listened too. Their small faces were tied with worry. The shed felt very small for the size of the danger. They planned quietly. Asha picked tasks and gave them in soft voices. "We will not fight with knives," she said. "We will use what we learn. We will be clever." Anne pressed his lips and drew lines on a scrap. Myra checked small tools. Jamil gathered ropes and cloth. Tarek carried a ladder like it was a promise. Their plan used small machines and small lies. One child rolled a fake report to the patrol and left it at a guard post. Another hid a simple horn that would sound like a frightened goat when the buyers passed. The clockwork drone would fly above and draw a guard's eye. While the guards looked up, Myra would slip under a cart and cut a rope. The plan was quiet and careful. On a road outside the market they found the buyers with the cart. The rain beat at their faces. Guards stood like tall dark trees. Asha's heart beat slow and loud in her ears. Anne wound the little drone with fingers that did not tremble. It rose with a small, awkward buzz and circled above the buyers. The guards turned to shout. The horn sounded, high and true, and made men look toward a different lane. In the wet confusion, Myra moved like water. She crawled under the cart, found the right rope, and cut it clean. The child inside the cart slipped free and a small hand clutched at Myra's coat. Jamil pushed forward with a woven basket and they wrapped the child and ran. The buyers shouted and threw ropes. The buyers used force, but the city's narrow streets were like mazes the children knew well. They reached the shed with wet clothes and fast breath. The rescued child cried and then slept in the lap of another child. They had scars and mud and a thin new fear that sat in the bones. They had also learned something stronger: they could act and win in a small way. The city answered with rules. The governor announced a curfew and harsher fines. The buyers said they would watch all roads. Guards checked carts more often. The market moved with tighter teeth. Inside the shed, the children argued. Some wanted to strike and burn. Some wanted to hide forever. Asha held up her hand and told a slow story about a river. "A river moves a mountain not with one stone but with many drops," she said. "We will use many small moves. We will use proof and careful plans." She taught them to gather proof receipts hidden in crates, oil marks on ropes, stamps on cloth. Proof would speak to people who had power and to sailors who still cared about their names. They began small sabotage that did not hurt people. They loosened a bolt on a crate so the seal would fail. They switched 2 labels so a buyer's special shipment arrived late. They hid a note inside a cloth seam that read a time and a place. These acts caused delay and worry. The buyers cursed and called for stronger guards, but they lost money and trust. All the while they built small machines and worked on a new frame for the drone. Jamil learned to fix a simple radio with wire and a broken earphone. Myra practiced removing a lock without a key. Tarek learned how to move heavy things quietly. Each lesson made them better and quieter. Then the danger came from a different side. A courier carrying a list of names and times was captured by the buyers on a market road. He was questioned and beaten. Under pain he cried a single name: classroom. The buyers wrote it down with a calm hand and a sharp smile. The buyers did not need to know the shed's exact door to start looking. They used money and fear to ask questions. A spice seller who had once been helped by Asha now turned away. A woman who mended shoes watched the shed and nodded to a buyer. Small eyes watched and small mouths told lies for silver. The buyers used the city like a net. Asha felt the world tighten. She folded a paper and put it in her pocket. "We must change," she told the children. "We must move from hiding to finding proof that the whole city can see." She taught them how to copy a receipt, how to take a photo with the drone and keep the picture secret until the right moment. They practiced passing messages with a bell under a bench. They practiced moving like shadows. One night, as rain fell again, the drone returned with a new scrap. The picture it had taken showed a buyer's ledger, a page with names and stamps and a route. The ledger had a mark Asha had seen before, a mark that connected the buyers to a shipping house with power. The children crowded around and read the words like a new language. That ledger changed the plan. They would no longer only rescue. They would show proof to sailors, to traders, to men who could stop ships. If ships would not carry the buyers' goods, the trade would stop. The buyers' power came from silence and ships. Taking away ships would take away power. But the buyers had a plan too. They whispered in the market and fed the governor with stories of danger. A public trial was set for children who escaped and for sellers who had refused to sell. The city would gather and watch and judge. The classroom had little time. Asha looked at the children around the lamp. Their small faces were bright with fear and steady with courage. She folded the ledger and put it in the smallest safe place. "We will show the city the truth," she said. "But first we must prepare." The night felt thin and tight. Outside, guards paced with louder steps. Inside, the children read the ledger again and learned how to turn a small proof into a loud truth. The trial would come soon. The classroom was ready to move from shadow to light. The city square filled fast the morning of the trial. Stalls closed early. People came because they wanted to see and because they wanted bread. Soldiers formed lines. Buyers sat with smooth faces. The governor stood high and spoke of law. The rescued children sat stiff and quiet. Their small hands held onto each other. Asha felt the cold of many eyes on her. She did not step into the square that day. She stayed with the class and the plans. The ledger they kept was folded in oilcloth and hidden under a loose floorboard. The ledger pages had names, stamps, and a governor's signature. It linked buyers to ships and to secret payments. If the ledger became real in public, the buyers would lose ships and money. That could break their power. They had one tool left, a small transmitter made from a broken radio, a coil from a lamp, and a battery that a dock worker had given them. It hummed like a bee when it had power. Anne learned how to fix the tiny wires. Jamil found a long wire to make an antenna. Myra climbed a pole at night and fastened it above the shed. The transmitter could not reach the whole city, but it could reach the docks and the ships that still watched trade. If sailors saw the ledger pages, some might refuse to carry children. If sailors refused, buyers would lose their trade. At dusk, when the square was loud with speeches and the governor's voice sounded like a drum, Asha and the children moved. They carried the transmitter on a cart of empty crates. They wore simple coats and acted like workers. A seamstress who owed them a favor stood in the square and began to sing a soft song, a tune that everyone knew. Her voice covered the small sounds the children made. They found a safe room under a trading house and set up the transmitter by candlelight. He placed the ledger pages under a small camera they had built from the drone's parts. The camera would flash and send images through the wire and into other towns. The small screen shivered when the first pages opened. Names showed. Stamps showed. A signature bent like a line on a tree. Across the waterways, men on ships saw the feed. A sailor on a small brig checked the image and stared. He knew some names. He had children. He watched the ledger again and again. His hands shook. He put down his fork and walked to the captain. Others on other ships saw the same. Rumors moved faster than the governor's words. At noon, a dock foreman refused to load a buyer's crate. He set the crate down and walked away. A captain cut the rope and would not lift. Merchants argued in the dockyard. The market began to wobble. For a bright hour the air felt like a string pulled tight. Then the buyers struck back. They called for proof. They shouted that the images were lies and trickery. The governor demanded the transmitter's arrest. He said traitors would face a hard punishment. His guards moved like wolves. Asha watched from the shed and felt the city tilt. She had wanted truth to break silence. She had not wanted blood. But the buyers grew cruel. They set a trap. That night they took a child in the square and made a show of power. They dragged the child and displayed ropes and keys and a loud voice to frighten the people. The crowd gasped. Some turned away. Fear walked like a heavy man through the streets. Asha felt the world narrow. She thought of the children sold in the market and of the mothers who could not sleep. She thought of the ledger and the little machines. She had taught lessons of skill and care. Now she asked if she had taught too much. She sat by the lamp and let questions press on her chest. Her hands trembled. For the first time she felt doubt. But the class was not ready to stop. And showed a new plan. We will not fight them with knives, he said. We will fight them with truth and with people who will stand with us. Myra and Jamil nodded. Tarek cut small strips of printed paper that looked like buyer receipts. They planned to plant these inside merchant offices where friendly sellers worked. If enough merchants saw proof, the buyers would lose more than money, they would lose trust. They worked through the night. The transmitter sent pages to a dozen towns. The small machines on their benches made little noises. The city moved under a thin rain. At dawn a small victory came. A captain refused a shipment and made a public statement. The buyers felt the ground shift. But then, smoke came. One morning the city alarm rang out. The central communication tower, the place where messages passed between towns and where the transmitter's signals often traveled, had a fire. Flames licked the wooden beams. Men ran with buckets and shouted names. The fire ate wires and pages and the small maps in a black mouth. People blamed the classroom at once. A buyer shouted that the classroom had sent lies and set the fire to hide proof. A guard found a small coil of wire near the tower and said it came from the shed. The city liked a single story, it liked a clear enemy. The ledger and the transmitter and the children were easy to name. Asha heard the news and felt the wind leave. The shed door banged as men pushed in. The seamstress who had sung was taken away. A child from the class was pulled from a line and held by two soldiers. They read the child a thin note, "You are under arrest." The governor's voice on the street was hard as stone. Inside the shed, fear crawled like cold. The children watched faces turn from hope to fear. The ledger was hidden, but the accusation burned like a brand. People who had once helped them closed their doors. The buyers smiled with teeth that did not know regret. Asha sat on the bench and held the rag doll. Her hands were steady now. She had a plan, but it would need help from more than small machines. She needed people who had keys, people who had ships, and people who would risk their names. She thought of the captain who had refused the shipment. She thought of the foreman at the dock who had left his crate. She stood and faced the class. The lamp made a circle at her feet. They will blame us to hide the truth, she said. We will show them the truth. We will find who burned the tower. We will not be afraid of smoke. Outside, the city argued and pointed fingers. Inside, the children learned a new lesson: when the world uses fire to hide, the slow work of truth must be louder than smoke. The trial had begun, and the real test was no longer only about proof. It was about trust. The city held its breath. Soldiers walked slower. Merchants watched their ledgers as if the numbers might move. The market smelled of fear and wet wood. The governor sat in his high room and called for answers. The buyers tightened their belts and whispered plans. The children in the shed listened to the sounds outside and prepared for the last lesson. Asha knew the danger. She also knew the ledger and the transmitter could change things. She gathered the class and spoke in a voice that was soft but clear. We will show them the truth, she said. We will not fight with knives. We will fight with knowledge and people who will stand with us. And wound the transmitter one last time. Jamil checked the wires. Myra climbed the pole and set the small camera to look like a working light. Tarek carried the battery like a steady heart. They moved like workers carrying a crate. A seamstress and a dock foreman waited at secret points, ready to act if sailors answered. At noon they began. The transmitter hummed and sent the ledger pages to boats and towns. The image of the governor's seal moved across small screens in the docks. Sailors saw the names and the stamped prices for children. A captain who had a daughter of his own felt his hands go cold. He put down his pipe and walked to the gangplank. One by one voices rose from the docks. A foreman refused to load a buyer's crate. A captain cut the rope and ordered his crew to stand down. Messages ran through the river of boats and down to small ports. Men who once looked away now spoke up. I will not carry that, a sailor said into a public square. Not for coin. When the buyers learned the ships would not leave, they tried one last plan. They sent a squad to seize the transmitter and to break the shed. They came fast with ropes and harsh faces. But the city had already begun to change. People who once pretended not to see now stepped forward. The seamstress who had sung in the square pulled a child close and pointed at a buyer. The dock foreman and a group of merchants stood with open hands and clear faces. Some guards lowered their spears and looked away from the buyers. A father in the crowd who had lost a son to the trade spat at the buyers and shouted for the law. The squad stopped at the edge of the market and found more than empty streets. Workers crowded the docks and the roads. They blocked the buyers' men. A simple show of ships refusing to move turned into a quiet rebellion. The buyers' men hesitated when faces in the crowd began to name names from the ledger. Fear moved through them faster than orders. Inside the square, the governor's voice sounded small. Merchants demanded proof and a safe trade. The council met in a panic. Some members who had once sat with buyers whispered to each other and then walked out into the square, where people watched. The buyers' power came from moving goods and hiding deals. Now their deals were in the open and the world watched. The buyers struck at last. They tried to take a child from the square to make an example. The crowd froze. For a moment it looked as if the old fear would win. Then the captain who had refused the shipment stepped forward. He placed his hand on the buyer's chest and said, "Not here. Not with my name." The crowd found a new sound, anger that smelled like justice. People shouted for the council to act. The council could not stand alone. Merchant houses threatened to stop trade if buyers stood in their way. Sailors refused to sail under market dishonor. The governor feared ruin more than change. In a day the council voted to arrest several buyers and to open an inquiry into the governor's contracts. Men who had hidden behind papers found the papers burned in public. The buyers were taken from their stalls. Their crates were opened and found full of cheap things, not the proofs they had shown. The city rallied and the market's ugly trade slowed. Children who had been hidden away were found in secret rooms and released. Families ran into arms and cried. Asha walked into the square with the rag doll in her bag. She felt tired and small and very heavy with the things she had taught. People watched her and some called her a teacher, some called her trouble. She did not answer. She walked to the edge of the crowd and opened the transmitter one last time. The ledger's pages lay flat in the sun. Names, stamps, and the governor's seal gleamed like bad metal. When the arrests came, some guards looked at the buyers' faces and could not feel proud. The city cheered and then fell silent with sorrow. Asha saw faces that had been lost for years. She saw mothers who had found children. She saw men who had stopped walking away. The shed became a place for mending. The benches were fixed. The lamp burned steady. Children came and learned more than letters. They learned how to make small machines that helped farms and how to read ships' manifests to protect workers. The classroom opened across the city. Teachers carried the plans and taught in hidden rooms and then in bright ones. The rag doll sat on a bench, patched and clean, a small flag of memory. Anne kept the folded map he had found inside the doll. It showed other ports where buyers still moved in secret. He handed it to Asha with a face that was both young and very old. She looked at the map and then at the city, at the people who had stood and at the boats that had refused to sail. She smiled like someone who had learned a hard truth and then taught it to others. Knowledge travels faster than fear, she said quietly. The city changed slowly and not in one clean day. New laws were written and old papers were burned. Merchants learned to check the stamps they trusted. Sailors and dock workers formed a network to refuse illegal cargo. Schools opened in houses that had once sold silence. The governor left his high room and walked among people to hear their stories. The buyers who stayed found honest work or left the port. In the years after, children told the story of a shed and a teacher who taught numbers to count more than coins. They told how small machines flew like birds and brought truth to ships. They told of a rag doll and a scrap of paper. The classroom grew into a network that taught many cities to read seals and names and to ask questions. Asha stood once more in a room full of children. She placed the little map on the table and let them look. Their eyes were bright and curious. She closed the door and stood by the lamp. Outside, a ship left the port, its sails full of wind and hope, carrying crates of tools and books instead of cages. The city had learned a new lesson: a taught mind is stronger than any coin.